So the word exercise, comes from the Latin exercitio, and it meant, to train. So we still do math exercises, or soldiers do exercises to get fit. But eventually, the term has changed its meaning, and it's developed new meanings. So on one hand, it means to do voluntary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. That's the kind of sort of fitness, physical activity kind of exercise. But on the other hand, it also means, to be exercised, means to be upset, to be confused, to be anxious, to be kind of worried. We get exercised by our math exercises, right? And so to me, it's part and parcel of this strange concept of exercise, right? It's this modern idea of doing voluntary, discretionary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. But we don't do it often. Most people don't do it because they want to. They do it because it helps stave off death and decrepitude, and in the modern world, of course, a lot of people are confused about it because they find it hard to do. They're not quite sure how much to do. There are all kinds of myths surrounding it. So very much people are exercised about exercise today, and really, I think that by shining the light of evolution and using kind of an anthropological perspective, my goal really is to help people be less exercised about exercise.
How evolution made us move.
I would say that the definition I use of exercise is pretty much the bog standard definition that people in the sort of fitness, exercise science world use. It's important to make a distinction between physical activity and exercise. So physical activity is just moving, right? When you do anything, right? Go shop, pick up your groceries and take them to your car. That's physical activity. When you sweep the kitchen floor, that's physical activity. But exercise is discretionary, voluntary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. So it can include everything from sports to running on a treadmill to going for a walk. I think the paradox of exercise is that everybody knows it's good for them. I don't know that really anyone who says they don't want to ever exercise, right? But the paradox is that most things that are good for us we kind of want to do, But exercise is kind of the reverse, right? It's something that we all know we want to do. It's good for us, and yet a lot of us have a hard time doing it. And the proof is in the data. According to the CDC, only about 20% of Americans get the very minimum levels of exercise that every health organization in the world thinks is the minimum for an adult, which is 150 minutes a week. So 80% of us really struggle and fail to get the very basic amounts of exercise, but almost everyone says that they want to get enough exercise. The most common reason that people don't like to do exercise, when you ask them, is that they don't have time. They find it stressful and they're busy, right? And that's a legitimate concern for a lot of people. Imagine if you have to commute a long distance, you have a job that is very sedentary, you got to deal with your kids in the evening, and or maybe you have two jobs or whatever. It's very challenging for people to exercise and to find the time in the modern world. The other reason that people often give for not exercising is they don't like to. They find it uncomfortable. They find it unpleasant. They find it, they get hot and bothered, and they don't feel like they get much reward out of it. And so they find there's a lot of inertia that prevents people from doing it. They have a hard time getting off the couch, and I think we need to be compassionate towards both of those reasons, right? Because yes, people are stressed for time, and yes, it is often unpleasant and unfun, but we make them feel bad about that, right? We make them feel bad for being stressed. We make them feel bad for having that inertia when actually it's completely normal. I mean, nobody ever exercised in the Stone Age, right? People were physically active when they had to be, and they might dance or do other play, do other things that were for fun, but volitionally going on a 5-mile run in the morning or going to the gym to lift weights whose sole purpose is to be lifted, that's a really strange, weird modern behavior. And there are all kinds of instincts that we have not to do it. And we shouldn't make people feel bad for having those instincts. Instead, we should help them figure out ways to overcome those instincts, because we live in a world where we now, because we've mechanized everything, right? We no longer have to be physically active. We now, in a very strange way, have to choose to be physically active. And that's not so easy. Oh my gosh, there are so many myths about exercise. It's hard to know where to start. But I would say that one myth is that our ancestors were sort of just natural, incredible athletes who just get up in bed in the morning and run ultra marathons at will and without ever much stress or difficulty. That our ancestors were really incredibly strong. That there's a trade-off between speed and strength. That you don't have to, that it's normal to be less physically active as you get older, that there's a perfect type of exercise, perfect amount of exercise, that sports equals exercise. I could go on. There's, the topic of exercise is just laden with myths. A common view about our sort of evolutionary origins and about the evolution of physical activity is that we evolved from these kind of super athlete kind of ancestors, and that civilization has sort of contaminated us. So if you wear shoes or you drink Gatorade or you have a fancy watch or something like that, somehow that kind of deprives you of the kind of natural talent that you have. And if only you had been born, in some little village somewhere and didn't have TV and didn't have access to all these commercial goods, that you'd be a natural, incredible athlete and that you could just get out of bed and, run an ultramarathon or something like that. A lot of these myths, to be honest, stem from, I think, this idea of, this Rousseauian idea of the myth of the noble savage, right? That humans uncontaminated by civilization are also sort of naturally good and fine. And they also come from terrible, horrible racist stereotypes about, for example, Africans not experiencing pain as much, and Asians having some kind of natural sort of proclivity to sneak around in the dark. We all know these stereotypes, and they're pernicious and they're wrong, and but they've been applied in various ways to hunter-gatherers and to subsistence farmers in various parts of the world, to make us feel that somehow they're like these kind of basically fundamental super athletes. And when you do that, I think you do harm to both to people all around the planet. You do harm to those populations because you kind of dehumanize them. I mean, when they run an ultramarathon, it's just as hard as when I were to try to run an ultramarathon. They sweat, they toil, they get nausea, they get cramps. They do it because it's not because it's easy for them. They do it because they value it. They think it's worth doing. And you also make people in the West feel terrible, like somehow there's something wrong with them, right? And they should throw away their shoes and eat a paleo diet or something like that. And all of a sudden, ta-da! They'll become this like amazing athlete, and that's just not true. That's just a myth, and it's pernicious in a variety of ways. In 2012, I had the good fortune to be invited to go to the Ironman World Championships in Kona in Hawaii. It's an amazing event, right? And if you don't know what an full Ironman triathlon's like, you start off with a 2.4 mile open water swim. Then the athletes rush out of the water, jump onto bikes with these like high-tech helmets and stuff like that. They speed off and they do a 112-mile bike ride across the desert. And then they come back, throw off their bike, jump off their bikes, and then they do a full marathon in the heat. It's like 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And it's really amazing. And the elite athletes do this in a little bit over 8 hours. They're just like cyborgs. They're not like human beings. It's astonishing to watch. And then the lesser athletes, take longer to do, and everybody has to finish by 17 hours, so by midnight. And it's really just astonishing to see people put their bodies through that kind of endurance to achieve something like that. And I was really impressed by that. I'd never seen a full Ironman before. And then just a few weeks later, I was in a very rural part of Mexico, in Chihuahua, up in the Sierra Tarahumara, where I got to observe a Rara Hipri, which is the traditional foot race that the Tarahumara Native Americans do. And it's kind of like almost like a soccer game. There are two teams, and they have a little round ball that's carved out of wood that morning. And there are about 5 people on each team, and they kind of kick the ball with their feet, and then chase it and find it, and then kick it again, and chase it and find it, kick it again. There's like a little circuit they do, and there are 2 teams, and whichever team laps the other team wins. And the race I saw must have been about 40, 50 miles long. And so it's another incredible endurance event. And on the surface, you'd say, oh my God, these events are totally different, right? Iron Man is very commercial, and everybody's wearing the fanciest, latest gear, and they've got super fancy shoes, and they're using gel and goo, and all kinds of specially formulated, nutrition drinks, and their bikes cost like $10,000, $20,000, and it's very commercial, right? And they're speakers and crowds, etc. Whereas the Tarahumara, when they're running, they're just wearing the clothes that they normally wear. They're running in sandals. It's very uncommercial. And you think, oh my gosh, it's so different. One is more authentic than the other. But if you stop and think, actually, they're very similar, right? Because both involve rewards, right? So Ironman, there's like, the winner, and the winner gets a prize, etc. Well, the Tarahumara also have prizes. They bet huge amounts of stuff, right? They bet clothes and goats and corn and stuff like that. They don't have Gatorade, but they make their own kind of form of Gatorade out of corn. It's called, and they cheer on their runners too, and there's the joy of victory and the agony of defeat and all that. So in some ways they're very different, but in other ways it's kind of the same thing, and it's a personal journey that people undertake. A very small number of them. The vast majority of people are observers. They're not participants. So really, it made me realize that, oh yes, there are some differences between sort of more modern, commercialized Western forms of endurance physical activity. This is something basic and fundamental that all cultures do. And actually, I think what makes us similar is greater than what makes us different. There are different kinds of training, right? Play is a form of training in a way, right? Children play, right? Because they're learning skills, they're developing capacities, and humans are one of the few species, dogs are another, that continue to play as adults, right? And that play helps us, maintain our capacities. It helps us with social relationships. There's all kinds of good things that happen with play, right? But exercise is kind of I wouldn't say exercise is generally play, although some play is exercise. And when you kind of exercise in order to, or train for like an event, you're doing something. You're spending a lot of energy. You're doing physical activity kind of to get ready for something, right? And certainly. For the kinds of things that we do, that's a very modern Western behavior. So when I was when I've talked to Native American runners who participate in these long distance races, and I asked them how they get ready for the race, how they train, they would kind of look at me like they didn't understand the question. There was, what are you talking about? And so, I was working with the translator. The translator was saying, this gringo, he runs 5 miles every day to kind of get ready for a race. And the question that I got was, why would you run if you didn't have to, right? Because their life is their training, right? When I ask people there or ask people in Africa, in the places where I work, like, when do you run? The most common answer I get is, oh, well, to chase a goat. That's the most common answer I get. There are a lot of ways to quantify how physically active somebody is, right? A very simple one, it's not necessarily the best one, but a simple way of doing it is what's called the physical activity level. It's just a ratio. So it's the total amount of energy you spend in a day divided by the energy you would spend if you were just in bed rest. What's called your basal metabolic rates, the energy you spend just taking care of the most basic essential functions of your body. And so, say if you're in bed rest, in a hospital, and lying in bed with just like a clicker for the TV, and you're doing absolutely nothing, not even digesting food, your physical activity level would be about physical activity level would be about a 1.2. And if you're like a Tour de France cyclist, it would be above 3. If you're kind of a desk worker, it'd be like 1.6. So it's kind of a way to compare individuals, but also species, because it's standardized by how your body size, because your body size essentially determines your basal metabolic rate. And it's interesting that most animals have physical activity levels of about 2 to 3. So they're pretty active. We evolved from apes, and it turns out that primates in general, and apes in particular, have really low PALs, really, really low physical activity levels. Chimpanzees have physical activity levels about 1.4. So their physical activity levels are actually lower than sedentary Americans. So your average sedentary American who doesn't really do much and, spends most of his or her time in chairs and, et cetera, and takes elevators and all that, is still more physically active, actually, than your average chimpanzee. Whereas hunter-gatherers, people who, every day have to go out and get their food, their physical activity levels tend to be around 2. to about 1.92. Subsistence farmers who don't have a lot of machines and tractors and stuff like that, they're maybe a little bit harder working, maybe 2.1, 2.2. And it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that people's physical activity levels were able to go down like about 25% to 1.6, 1.7, which is sort of typical of your average American. So it's a useful kind of simple standard to help us compare just generally how active different groups or different individuals are. So your basal metabolic rate is a really important number because it tells you kind of just how much energy you're spending on just the essential maintenance of your body, paying for your brain and paying for all the tissues in your body. And, you have to turn over tissues all the time. Like the cells in your gut are being replaced like every 5 days or so. I mean, your fingernails are growing. Everything's happening in your body, right? And that all costs energy. And it turns out that a kind of typical, say, adult male my size, right? I'm not all that big, but spends about 2/3 of his or her physical metabolism just on basal metabolic rate. So I spend about 1,600 calories a day just existing, just taking care of my body. So the vast majority of the energy that we spend isn't spent on running around and being physically active and moving. It's actually spent on just maintenance, just basic total maintenance. And that's one of the reasons why we kind of never evolved not to be all that physically active when it wasn't necessary, because until recently, energy used to be limited, right? It wasn't like, 7-Elevens or Dunkin' Donuts or Whole Foods or whatever your, favorite place to get food is right around the corner. If you wanted something to eat, you had to go find it. You had to either, hunt it or gather it or dig it up. And so energy was limited. And when energy is limited, you have to engage in trade-offs, right? And so if you spend energy on physical activity, that means you're not spending energy on taking care of your body or reproducing, which is what the only thing natural selection really cares about. And so the fact that our bodies are so expensive helps explain why we tend to avoid unnecessary physical activity, because it prevents, like, for example, this morning I went for a 5-mile run. So I spent about 500 calories. Those are 500 calories that I could have spent on my metabolism. And if I were energy limited, that would have been a bit of a problem, right? Which is why people who are energy limited and already physically active, it makes no sense for them to go for a needless, completely pointless 5-mile run in the morning. So technically, a calorie is the amount of energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade, right? So it's a unit of energy. And so we convert various kinds of energy into calories. There are other units of energy, like the joule, for example. But the calories are kind of a useful one, and it's because we all, our food is labeled in calories. So calories are the most common one. But actually, the calories that we mostly talk about that are on our food labels are actually kilocalories. They're actually 1,000 calories. So when you look at a label for a chocolate bar or a can of beans or something, and it says there are 50 calories, it actually means that there are 50,000 calories, right? But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that's fine. But so most of the time we're talking about calories with a capital C or kcal, kilocalories, and our bodies use a lot of calories. Typical human body spends about 2,000 to 3,000 calories, or in this case kilocalories a day, existing. That's your basal metabolic rate plus all the energy you spend running around, doing chores, making dinner, whatever it is you do for your day. When you go for a walk, you probably spend an extra 50 calories per mile. If you go for a run, you're spending probably an extra 100 calories per mile for that run. So that kind of hopefully gives you a sense of sort of what kind of energy amounts we're talking about.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.